At 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve, people raise their phones for a last clip before midnight. The light is low, the streets are quieter. In that small pocket of breath between years, ordinary cameras sometimes catch something that feels anything but ordinary. One handheld submission begins with a trembling frame aimed at a pile of discarded boxes in an attic. The camera hunts for a subject, then freezes on a pale, crescent-shaped curve behind torn cardboard. A tiny, high laugh comes through the mic, thin and sharp. For a beat, you think it's a face. Then a slow red bead glints where you wouldn't expect color in near darkness. The sender, a woman named Marissa, typed, "We left the house. We're not going back tonight." She didn't laugh. She didn't scoff. She left. We open here because attics are threshold spaces by design, tucked between lived rooms and the roof, full of forgotten things, full of partial silhouettes. On New Year's Eve, when attention is split between the device in your hand and the promise of midnight, a simple shape can resolve into an image that feels personal, almost intent. We want to be clear, the clip is unsettling. We also want to be clear about what we're seeing and what else might explain it. The image reads like a crescent of pale material, thin as packing paper or old insulation, punctuated by a tiny spot of warm red. The laugh in the audio track registers as an isolated high-frequency burst. Low-light bloom is apparent across the frame, a haloing effect. When a camera sensor struggles in the dark, bright areas can smear into soft glowing edges. Low-light bloom occurs because the sensor's pixels, trying to gather enough light, blur into neighboring pixels. The result can exaggerate shapes and create the suggestion of features where none exist. A quick test for this is to compare the suspected frame with an uncompressed original. Compressed files amplify bloom by discarding subtler variations in brightness. Pareidolia is part of the psychological backdrop here. Pareidolia is the brain's tendency to read familiar patterns, a face, a pair of eyes, into ambiguous visual noise. It's not dishonesty, it's how human perception works, especially at night. In this clip, pareidolia may be coaxed by the combination of shadow, low-light bloom, and the expectation of something watching from the boxes. But none of those terms explain the laugh. Audio is a different animal. Consumer microphones, especially on phones, are omnidirectional. They pick up sound from every angle. In tight spaces like attics, sound bounces off rafters and insulation in unexpected ways. Phase issues, when the same sound reaches different mic elements slightly out of sync, can create unexpected peaks in the waveform that sound like discrete events. In plain terms, the laugh could be something entirely ordinary recorded oddly. There are also several mundane physical possibilities we have to consider.
A moth or a small bat, wings catching a sliver of light, could create a pale, moving shape. Rusted metal or an old doll's porcelain fragment can reflect a warm spot of color that reads as red on a low-fidelity sensor. A loose piece of insulation, shifted by a thermal draft from a furnace, can appear to lean forward and then snap back. Motion blur will stretch that motion into a fluid, inhuman arc. To test these possibilities practically, get an uncompressed version of the file, examine it frame by frame at the original resolution, and if possible, inspect the attic with a neutral light source and a wide-angle camera to recreate the angles. We won't pretend to know what Marissa felt the night she filmed this. She left the house. Her mother, listed in the submission as Ma, refused to come up into the space again. That fear is part of the evidentiary picture. Emotional truth matters. It does not, however, turn an ambiguous clip into proof. About 20 minutes later, we watched a home video from an Arkansas household where a persona had already taken shape. Ghost Malone. The name arrived on social media before any explanation did. The clip opens as the clock closes on the evening, a narrow hallway lit only by a hallway lamp, the camera steady on a toy car resting near the baseboard. At 11:59 p.m., the submitter writes this as the timestamp, original metadata listed indefinito. The toy begins to glide across hardwood on its own, gathering pace toward a framed photograph, which then tilts as if touched by an invisible hand. A door in the background squeaks and inches closed. Before we move from the images, we should put forward basic mechanical possibilities. Tiny shifts in floorboards, common in older houses, can create slow, biased slopes where a small wheeled object will roll. People underestimate how often living spaces settle differently as today's heat yields tonight's chill. Thermal contraction can change the plane of a floor by tiny degrees. Airflow is another simple explanation. HVAC systems, open vents, or a draft from a poorly closed window can generate enough push to set a small, low-friction object in motion. Ropes, strings, or pulls hidden in the frame can be staged, intentionally or not. We emphasize, none of these explanations demand malice or staging. They are common physical causes. There are social dynamics layered atop the raw footage that deserve attention. Naming a presence, Ghost Malone, is a ritual act. It transforms scattered, ambiguous incidents into an identity. Once a name exists online, feedback loops take over. Viewers begin to expect more. Comments refashion perception into pattern. If someone posts a slurry of related incidents with a name attached, other households and streamers will adopt the same language and start to interpret every creak as a visit. This is not to dismiss the household's fear.
The people living in that home became convinced enough to apply ritual responses, salt along thresholds, prayers at doors, and those responses are part of the social data we must weigh. They speak to the experience's reality for them, even if the mechanism may be natural. In the same cluster is a short, tense video from a parent called Marissa. She sent a grainy clip recorded at 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve, she said. Again, the file's original timestamp was indefinito in the metadata we examined. The footage shows a toddler asleep on a couch clutching a stuffed rabbit. The camera is close, its mic picking up the soft hum of a television off camera. At the edge of the frame, the rabbit's head pivots, as if turned by a hand that never appears on camera. This is the moment where the stakes are different. When a child's object appears to behave independently, the emotional intensity rises. Protecting identities here is critical. We anonymize, we avoid close-ups that would identify the child, and we preserve the parent's fear without turning it into spectacle. Technically, several plausible mechanisms can create the illusion of autonomous movement. A loose seam or a flexible internal wire in a stuffed toy can settle differently when the body of the toy shifts. A finger, off-frame, perhaps briefly behind a cushion, can push ahead and then retract. Compression smoothing in lower bitrate video can blur abrupt motions across several frames, making a single push turn look like a slow, deliberate swivel. Another possibility is frame rate aliasing. When motion occurs at speeds that interact oddly with a camera's frame rate, the illusion of motion direction or speed can flip. To test for these, we recommend obtaining the original, highest quality file. Recordings at higher frame rates and with a broader field of view make it easier to detect off-frame interference or subtle puppet-like structures. We also must weigh motive and context. Parents under stress, working late, or playing for the camera on a holiday night may unintentionally stage something for attention. Alternatively, the household could be genuinely bewildered. We're not here to assign motives. We're here to list what is visible, what is technically plausible, and what further evidence would be needed to narrow down the possibilities. After these three domestic vignettes, the attic, the mysterious household with its named presence, and the child's toy, a pattern emerges that's worth pausing on. Small, intimate spaces, objects of scale against human bodies, moments captured at low light, and crucially, people in a heightened emotional state, because it's the cusp of a new year. There's also a technological through line. Cheap sensors and phones doing their best in the dark, compression algorithms that smooth motion and exaggerate color, omnidirectional microphones that catch echoes as discrete events. These are not exotic problems.
They are the practical constraints of modern eyewitness footage. If you have footage recorded at or around 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve, whether it's odd lights, unexplained movement, or something you can't name, we read every submission. Send it to the single email in the description and include the original file if you can. Original files matter. They reveal metadata, they let us examine individual frames, and they can make the difference between an ambiguous blur and a solvable artifact. We move now out of houses, away from couches and cardboard, into places that were built to be secret. The next clip comes from an urban explorer who spent the night in a disused Cold War bunker. The footage we received is a GoPro POV, wide angle, slightly fisheye, mounted at chest height. The timestamp on screen set to 11:59 p.m. per the submitter's note. The original file's timestamp again reads indefinito. The light is a ring of portable LEDs. The corridor is long and tiled with metal grating. The camera's built-in mic catches distant reverberation, water, the clack of a loose tile, their breath. Midway down the corridor, the explorer panics. Something moves in a patch of shadow, long, vertical smears against a concrete doorway, a blur that suggests limbs longer than a human's sleeves would allow. The explorer starts to run. Footsteps pound. The camera tilts. For a second, the smear resolves into a dark coat hanging on a peg, then into nothing. In the footage, there's a momentary breathy sound, a short inhalation audible just before the camera shakes. The viewer feels the panic. There are several technical elements we need to unpack for this clip. Motion blur is one such element. In low light, the camera exposes for longer per frame to collect more photons. Any movement within that exposure window will smear across the frame. The result is an elongated streak rather than a discrete body.
Motion blur, in this sense, can make an object seem longer or more fluid than it is. GoPros, with their wide-angle lenses, also introduce distortion that can stretch objects at the edges of the frame. Pull those two effects together, and you get a scene where a coat swinging on a hook can appear to be a tall, moving figure. There are also acoustic considerations. The GoPro's mic is small and often mounted in a position that exaggerates wind, rustle from clothing, and the operator's own breathing. A short inhalation, which the explorer later repeated in his text to us as, "I heard someone breathing right behind me," can be an artifact of the mic picking up the operator's own chest or an echo from a small opening, intensified by the corrugated metal surfaces of the bunker. Omnidirectional mics will blur spatial cues. You can hear breath but struggle to locate it directionally. Trespass risk is real here and needs to be stated plainly. Abandoned bunkers can be structurally unsafe, may contain hazardous materials, and are often private property.
We do not advise entering such spaces for investigation. If you choose to explore, make safety your first priority. Bring a partner, protective gear, and permission where possible. Technically plausible alternatives to a long-limbed entity include a coat or a hanging tarp moved by a gust from the explorer's passing, a person crouched behind a doorway whose limbs stretched into the frame during a slow shutter exposure, or even a stray animal like a large dog or a raccoon caught in distortion. In this clip, the explorer's panic and the immediacy of the reaction argue for an authentic experience. But authenticity of emotion is not the same as authentication of the cause. We examined the clip frame by frame. At 0037, a vertical smear begins at the upper third of the frame and persists for 3 frames. On a standard recording at 30 frames per second, 3 frames represent a tenth of a second. That's enough time for a rapid motion to stretch, but not enough for a stable, deliberate posture to read as long-limbed. If the original file were shot at a higher frame rate, say 60 or 120 frames per second, we might see the motion broken into more discrete positions that reveal a hinged limb or a swinging coat. Practical follow-ups here include requesting the original file, confirming the camera's frame rate and exposure settings, and seeking a second camera angle if one exists. There's a human factor we must not overlook. The urban explorers writing to us, short messages sent after the event, includes the phrase, "I've never run like that before." Panic is contagious, and so is the memory of it. Memory tightens around a specific interpretation in the hours after an event. Adrenaline edits detail into something more coherent and often more dramatic than what actually occurred. That's not to minimize the experience. It's to suggest that when an explorer insists later that what they saw could not have been a coat, their conviction is as much a part of the record as the pixels are. Listen to the audio again and notice the inhalation we mentioned. Microphone phase and proximity effects can create the illusion of an external breath when it's actually the operator's own. One practical test is to compare the mic waveform across the entire clip. If the sudden breath-like spike aligns with the operator's footfall or a head turn, it may be internal. If the spike is recorded on a separate audio channel from a second camera or an external recorder, then it gains evidentiary weight. We'll pause here briefly to recap the through line so far. Each case shares some technical constraints: low light, limited sensor fidelity, compressed files, and single-angle perspectives. Each case also shares a social component: how the people involved react, label, and narrate what they've experienced.
The attic clip gives us an image that reads like a face. The Arkansas house shows the dynamics of a named presence and ritual response. The child's toy raises stakes and protections. The bunker introduces the hazards of exploration and the limits of GoPro imaging. These are building blocks. Put together, they form the kind of dataset that makes causation difficult to settle on a single conclusion. We are not closing the inquiry. There is more to examine in the bunker footage: additional frames, alternative audio processing, and the explorer's route through the complex, and we will return to it. There are also more submissions that escalate in darkness and in the stakes they pose: a live-streamed scraping sound captured on a collector's channel, an array of darting lights over a cloud deck that a suburban family filmed as midnight approached, and a multi-camera installation in an old mansion that recorded what sounds like footsteps on an empty landing. Before we go any further, a note on how to test these clips empirically. If you are submitting footage you want taken seriously, include the original uncompressed file. Metadata tells us the camera make and model, the frame rate and exposure, and sometimes the GPS coordinates. Multi-angle recordings are gold. If 2 cameras capture the same event from different positions, you can triangulate the motion and often rule out most artifacts. If possible, produce a short reenactment under controlled conditions. Repeat what you did with neutral lighting and a fixed camera, then show both takes. Finally, consult experts. A cinematographer can demonstrate how low light effects behave, An acoustician can analyze waveforms. An animal behaviorist can identify likely critters. A structural engineer can explain how a floor may move with temperature changes. We will recommend follow-ups on a case-by-case basis as we continue. We step deeper into that continuing inquiry now. The next clip, which we'll begin to unpack, comes from a collector who streams nightly and deals in antique dolls. The channel has a modest following. The streamer has cultivated a reputation for dramatic atmosphere. At 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve, mid-stream, the feed captured a scraping sound beneath the table where a row of dolls sat. The scraping is a low-frequency metallic rasp that seems to come from a floorboard. No visible object moves in the camera's frame. Live streaming creates its own ecology. The chat instantly filled with speculation. Wind, an animal, a prank. The streamer, guarded and practiced at managing audience expectation, narrated in real time, which complicates the evidentiary chain. The live commentary, audience overlay, and potential for overlays or audio manipulation after the fact all must be separated from the raw recording. Live feedback loops can also generate expectation. Viewers begin to look for movement and then interpret random sensor noise as meaningful. Audio-wise, several possibilities exist.
A floorboard scraping could be caused by a settling joist reacting to heat from a nearby radiator. It could be a small object shifted by a vibration, a glass, a doll stand, a piece of metal. It could be inauthentic overlay, a sound added post-production or during the live stream as a prank. We define here briefly what we mean by a compression artifact in audio. When audio data is compressed, less important frequency information is removed. This can smudge transient sounds, causing short noises to sound like drawn-out rasping or to gain artificial resonance. A simple test is to request the original stream archive or the raw clip from the streamer's hardware recorder. If that file preserves a discrete sharp transient instead of a drawn scraping rasp, compression likely changed perception. The scraping in this clip did something else that matters. It changed how the streamer and the audience behaved. Several viewers told the streamer to move the dolls. Others muttered about curses. The streamer, facing a live audience, reacted with a mixture of bravado and real concern. This is another example of emotional reality shaping the narrative. Whether or not the scraping had a mundane cause, the social dynamics that followed, people naming, daring, and amplifying, pushed the situation towards something performative. We will analyze the collector's audio in more detail, but for now we'll make two recommendations. 1. Secure the raw recording and the microphone's placement data. And 2. Consider recreating the set under similar ambient conditions to see whether the same scraping recurs. If it does, you have a reproducible mechanical explanation. If it doesn't, the mystery deepens. There is an aerial case that will raise different questions. A family's New Year's submission of clustered darting lights over a low cloud deck. They filmed from a backyard at about 11:59 p.m., a quiet suburban night with no fireworks recorded on the clip. The lights move with an agility that seems to contradict simple drone explanations. They appear to split and regroup, darting like shoals of fish across a low, illuminated cloud layer. Aerial phenomena invite a different taxonomy of possibilities. Drones are ubiquitous and increasingly capable of coordinated flight. Searchlights and spotlights can create moving reflections on cloud layers. Ball lightning, an extremely rare atmospheric event, gets invoked more often than it should. It does exist, but it lacks a consistent, replicable signature in amateur footage. Lens artifacts, particularly on phones with multiple lenses and computational stitching, can create ghost images. A light in one part of the frame can be reflected within the lens assembly and appear as a second offset light. Frame rate aliasing can make rapid blinking or oscillation appear as coordinated motion.
If a family's clip shows multiple independent lights that coordinate in a way that suggests intelligent control, the number one follow-up is collateral verification. Did neighbors witness it? Were any radios or weather logs noting unusual atmospheric conditions? Can the original file be cross-referenced with any local drone activity permissions? We do not have those corroborating data for this submission, so we mark the original timestamp and provenance as indefinito and suggest the family reach out to local authorities and airspace logs, not to make claims, but to gather possible corroboration. We have already drifted into territory where direct observation meets the limits of evidence: fixed cameras, single-angle captures, compressed files, and people's memories. The final clip we'll begin to examine in this part is the most contested: a fixed camera on a landing in an old mansion, submitted by an urban exploration group who call the site Selma Mansion. The camera is a fixed surveillance-style unit pointed down a stairwell toward a landing. The feed shows a quiet, dust-muted staircase. At 11:59 p.m., the crew insists the clip occurred just before midnight on New Year's Eve. Their file's metadata reads indefinito. The audio track picks up an abrupt series of knocks and a low inhalation sound. The video shows nothing moving on the landing. Fixed camera footage removes some uncertainties because the perspective is static, but it has its own artifacts. Microphones mounted on cameras can suffer from handling noise transmitted through the mounting hardware, and cameras' exposure algorithms will react to sudden changes in light by adjusting gain, which can create the illusion of a shadow passing. Acoustic effects inside an enclosed staircase are complex. A single small sound, a trapped pigeon or a settling piece of plaster, can reverberate as a knock 3 times over and then settle into a sound that resembles a human breath when played through the camera's limited mic. For the mansion case, the exploration team provided a transcript of the audio reaction from the group, incredulous whispers, then someone asking if anyone else heard it. That reaction is important. It anchors authenticity of experience. At the same time, a single fixed camera is vulnerable to false negatives. The camera may miss a brief motion occurring just outside its field of view. The team also provided a second handheld clip shot earlier that night, showing loose sections of the banister and a ventilation shaft near the landing. Those details matter. A vent can carry a distant noise to the camera's mic, and loose banister pieces can cause unexpected knocks if the building is settling. We have started to pull spectral data from the recorded audio to look for telltale signs of mechanical versus organic sources.
Mechanical impacts often show short, high-energy transients with broad frequency content. Biological breathing is more concentrated in lower frequencies and shows a distinct periodicity. The initial analysis is ambiguous. The knocks in the Selma audio register as short transients, but the inhalation has low-frequency energy consistent with the breath. That leaves multiple plausible narratives: a trespasser walking the landing and breathing near a vent, an animal trapped in the shaft, or an acoustic artifact responding to a distant noise. We stop here to underline a point about evidence standards. One clip on its own, especially a single audio channel on a single camera, cannot carry a conclusive claim. The standard we use for moving from unexplained to compelling includes original, uncompressed files, multi-angle corroboration, conserved metadata, and, where available, expert analysis from a cinematographer or an acoustician. For the Selma clip, any of these would help. Right now, the recording is stubbornly ambiguous. There's also a moral and legal duty to consider. When footage involves potentially trespassing in dangerous, private, or derelict buildings, we must advise caution. Don't enter properties without permission. Don't encourage others to do so for the sake of evidence. Injuries in abandoned buildings are common, and legal consequences are too. We're about to return to the bunker clip to look more closely at the successive frames where the smear recurs and where a sound, initially dismissed as operator breath, might align with another impact on the wall. We will also dig deeper into the collector's live stream to determine whether the scraping had spectral signatures consistent with a metal-on-wood friction or whether it resembles compressed transient smearing. And we will pull up the family's sky clip against a library of drone signatures and lens ghost patterns to see what matches best. But before we proceed, take stock with us. At the edge of a year, people are predisposed to look backward and forward simultaneously. They hold their phones like talismans, and those devices become both witness and filter. The combination of human expectation, low-light camera limits, and the social economy of sharing creates a potent mix. Some phenomena evaporate under scrutiny, others remain stubbornly unresolved. We move now back into the bunker footage to follow the smear toward a corner where the explorer claims he heard a chain rattle. The camera tips and the light catches metal, a glint that could be a hook or a droplet of condensation. The explorer's voice, clipped and fast, repeats, "There's someone there." We slow the clip and isolate the frames surrounding the moment of panic. Frame by frame, the vertical smear begins to chunk into discrete lobes on closer inspection.
At 003701, a faint vertical edge appears where there had been only darkness. At 003704, the smear leans left. At 003706, the shape dissolves as the explorer turns. A plausible explanation remains a coat on a hook that was set in motion by the explorer's passing. But here is where physics meets narrative. The timing of the explorer's shout and the visible shift are almost simultaneous. That makes it hard to dismiss the experience as purely internal to the camera sensor. We listen to the audio on high gain. There is a faint metallic rattle at 003705 that, when we run it through a basic spectral analysis, shows multiple narrowband peaks suggestive of metal striking metal. This is not definitive. Ambient mechanical noise in old structures can create harmonics that resemble metallic impacts. But it is a data point that leans toward an external cause. We request, again, the original file and any additional audio recorded off-camera. If the explorer happened to have a phone in his pocket recording separately, it could provide the corroboration necessary to triangulate whether the rattle came from a location consistent with a person moving through the corridor. We'll stop this segment of the analysis here and pick up once we've run the bunker audio through a forensic filter and compared the collector's scraping to the mansion's knocking in search of shared acoustic fingerprints. The pattern we're tracing, intimate spaces, low light, technological artifacts, and strong emotional investment, continues to show up, But the more we analyze, the more the casework diverges. Some clips resolve into simple physics, others remain ambiguous even after rigorous testing. The question is not whether such footage is interesting. The question is how much confidence we can assign to particular explanations, and what kinds of follow-up will move an incident from unexplained to likely mechanical, or in the rarest circumstances, requires further investigation. We continue. We return to the bunker clip with the tools of analysis turned up a notch. We ran the Explorer's audio through a forensic chain, noise reduction, high-pass filters to remove rumble, and a spectrogram to visualize energy across frequencies over time. A spectrogram is simply a picture that shows which frequencies are present in a sound and when they occur. It lets us see whether a noise is broadband, like a clap or impact that contains many frequencies at once, or narrowband, which is typical of tonal mechanical resonances. In the bunker file, the knocks register as short broadband bursts. The metallic rattle that follows produces a set of narrowband peaks that persist for a fraction of a second. That pattern is consistent with a metal object striking a metal surface and then resonating. We also ran a cross-check between the GoPro's on-camera mic and the operator's phone audio. The submitter later provided a pocket audio file.
Cross-correlation is a method that compares two waveforms to see how similar they are and whether one leads or lags the other. If a sound appears on both devices with the same timing and similar spectral content, it's more likely to be an external event rather than an artifact of a single microphone. The result here is telling but not definitive. The knocks show up on both channels, but with a slight lead on the GoPro, the sort of lead that can be explained if the GoPro's mic has a different proximity to the sound source or slightly faster preamp response. In short, the sound appears in more than one recorder, which raises the evidentiary weight, but the timing differences are small enough that we still need to rule out structure-borne echoes or mechanical settling as the origin. We tried a basic acoustic plausibility test in situ. The Explorer returned with a small, non-destructive test, a controlled tap on a metal pipe near the corridor. Asked to keep the camera angles identical and to record the sound with both the GoPro and a pocket recorder, they struck the pipe and then replayed the files to us. The resulting spectrogram showed a similar narrow band resonance and a short broadband transient, remarkably like the original clip's profile. That doesn't prove the original event was the pipe. It demonstrates that the acoustic environment is capable of producing a very similar signature from innocent sources. When two different mechanical actions produce similar fingerprints, the most parsimonious explanation often remains. Old buildings have many resonant elements that can masquerade as more sinister causes. There was, however, one stubborn wrinkle. The Explorer's visual frames show motion timed to the knock sequence. The smear that suggested a long-limbed figure appears within a narrow window surrounding the knocks. Motion blur, wide-angle distortion, and a swinging coat remain plausible visual causes, but the near simultaneity means we must treat the visual and acoustic data together, not apart. Our working hypothesis for now is this. An external mechanical event, a loose metal object or event, generated a knock and a sympathetic vibration. The camera's exposure and the operator's movement produced the elongated visual smear. The Explorer's alarm, amplified by adrenaline, locked that pair of signals into a cohesive, frightening memory. We emphasized earlier the difference between emotional authenticity and evidentiary proof. The GoPro clip is emotionally authentic, the fear is real, and the recordings capture it. But authenticity does not equate to supernatural causation. The reasonable investigative path is to document what can be reproduced and what cannot. For the bunker, we recommend an expanded follow-up, a controlled acoustic survey of the corridor with calibrated impulse sources, harmless taps, and multi-angle microphones.
That's a research approach, not an instruction for sensational entry into dangerous spaces. It's the kind of work that should be done with permission, by trained people, and with safety gear. We move from metal on metal to the scraping on the collector's live stream. Here the challenge is separating live performance from raw recording. The streamer's archive file, the one most likely to retain an unaltered copy, is the bedrock of any analysis. Compression, particularly in live streaming, eats transients. Transients are short, high-energy events like clicks, scrapes, or impacts. When a transient is compressed, its fine spectral detail can be lost, and the brain fills the gap, sometimes pulling in expectations supplied by chat or the streamer's commentary. We obtained the archived stream file and a local recorder file that the streamer used as a backup. The archive, which had been passed through the streaming platform's codec, presented the scraping as an extended rasp occupying a broad band from roughly 500 to 2500 Hz. The backup, recorded locally at a higher bitrate, revealed a sharper initial transient with a brighter high-frequency component, more like a localized metal-on-wood scrape. This difference is a textbook example of compression altering perception. The streaming codec smeared the initial click across time, giving the scrape a longer quality and making it sound more ominous. To test the mechanical hypothesis, we performed a controlled recreation in the streamer's room.
a small metal tool dragged along the baseboard, a toy stand shifting, and a radiator valve moving loosely. Microphones recorded the events. The radiator valve produced a scraping spectrogram closest to the archived stream's rasp. The metal tool created a concentrated high-frequency transient, more similar to the backup file's initial spike. The conclusion: both mechanical radiators and small metal objects can create similar signatures, and streaming compression can mask the true nature of a sound. The social dimension matters as much as the spectral one. On New Year's Eve, a streamer's channel is loaded with expectation. Chat becomes a chorus that nudges interpretation. Someone types curse, others dare the streamer to touch the dolls, and the streamer's voice betrays both showmanship and anxiety. That combination produces a feedback loop. If the streamer fakes a reaction, the video may be performative. If the streamer genuinely hears a scrape, the audience's expectation will supply a narrative to the noise. Either way, the archived local file is our ground truth. When the local file contains a discrete transient consistent with a radiator or a settling floorboard, the path to a mundane explanation is clear. If the local file mirrored an overlay or showed signs of post-production, we treat it very differently. In this case, the local file favored an explainable mechanical source influenced by platform compression. We switch gears now to the skylights.
The family's clip of clustered lights darting across a low cloud deck is visually striking. A thin band of cloud, backlit by urban glow, and a group of pinpoints moving in patterns that feel coordinated. The first-order tests you run for aerial phenomena are simple and empirical. Move laterally while keeping the camera pointed and watch parallax. Rotate the camera slowly and note whether apparent motion is camera-induced. Look for reflections or ghosts by covering secondary lenses. And, crucially, seek corroboration from independent witnesses.
People often report a sensed presence, pressure on the chest, or visual figures. It's common enough and often accompanied by strong emotion. Paul's account is consistent with those descriptions: a dark figure at the edge of a room, a cold sensation, and an imprint that lasted into adolescence. We do not dismiss the experience, rather we contextualize it. Human memory reconstructs rather than faithfully replays. Over time, details are pruned, and emotional tone can amplify structural elements. Paul's memory is testimony to his experience. It is not, by itself, a reproducible, verifiable event. That distinction matters in an evidentiary setting. It is also why psychological and neurological perspectives are indispensable when working paranormal claims that hinge on recollection. We arrive now at the Selma mansion for a close, comparative analysis. The group submitted 3 files: the fixed landing cam, the primary contested clip, a handheld reaction clip taken minutes earlier, and a short audio-only clip recorded by a second member. We ran all 3 through a synchronized timeline and performed spectral cross-correlation across the 3 channels. Cross-correlation between channels showed the NOx and low-frequency inhalation-like event appearing within a 15 to 30 millisecond window across devices. In acoustics, millisecond-level alignment across separate recorders is meaningful. It suggests a common external source rather than an electronic artifact unique to one recorder. However, buildings create echoes and reverberation that can smear timing, and camera mics have different frequency responses that change perceived timing slightly. We applied a deconvolution filter to attempt to strip the room's reverberant tail from the NOx. Deconvolution is the rough acoustic equivalent of subtracting the room's fingerprint from a sound to reveal the direct source. The deconvoluted NOx retained a short, high-energy transient, which leans slightly toward a mechanical impact. The inhalation-like component, however, remains strongly concentrated in lower frequencies, the kind of energy you'd expect from a breath or a distant HVAC rumble passing through a vent opening. Crucially, the handheld clip shows a detail the fixed cam misses: a vent cover that appears to have been partially dislodged. That vent sits roughly opposite the landing. When we played a controlled low-frequency sweep near the vent, the fixed camera's mic picked up a low-frequency surge and a subsequent harmonic that, when compressed by the camera's internal processing, could read as a breath. That suggests at least one plausible narrative. A distant mechanical or structural event produced the NOx. A vent or shaft carried resonant low-frequency energy that the camera's mic translated into a breath-like oscillation. The explorers heard it, reacted, and their voices then became part of the recording. Again, none of this proves a supernatural presence.
It does, however, flesh out a plausible mechanical chain. The explorers' reaction, whispering, checking corners, and asking one another if they heard it, is genuine and understandable. In our view, the Selma recordings become far more informative when treated as a set. Image, handheld context, and additional audio all together raise the evidentiary grade above a single isolated clip. That's a practical point for anyone submitting material. Multiple synchronized recorders dramatically change what can be concluded.
By now, patterns are clearer. Liminal spaces, attics, landings, basements, the in-between places of architecture show up repeatedly. They are not inherently supernatural, they are simply acoustically and visually ambiguous. They have poor lighting, uneven surfaces, and many resonant materials. Cameras struggle there. Cheap sensors amplify bloom. Compression smears transients. People inside those spaces are often emotionally primed, late night, chilled, attentive to small events, and social platforms reward the dramatic. The result is a steady pipeline of recordings that are compelling on first watch and stubborn under scrutiny. What do we ask of submitters who want their footage taken seriously? First, supply the original uncompressed file. Metadata is not trivia. It tells us frame rate, exposure, codec, and sometimes GPS. Second, provide corroborating angles whenever possible. A single camera view is brittle. Third, document what you did immediately after the event, where everyone was, whether anyone touched the scene, and what ambient conditions were like. That kind of contemporaneous record helps rule out tampering or later performance. Fourth, if the event involves private property or potentially unsafe locations, do not return alone or without permission. Injuries and legal consequences are real, and we will not valorize risky behavior for the sake of a mystery. We should also speak directly to skeptics and to believers alike about standards. An unexplained clip is an invitation to investigate, not a verdict. A clip that resists easy explanation can be interesting in its own right. It can be a prompt for better evidence gathering. And some clips, even after extensive testing, remain stubbornly unresolved. Unresolved does not mean supernatural, any more than mechanically explained means boring. Both outcomes are valuable epistemic positions. One reduces plausibility for exotic explanations by identifying a mundane chain. The other highlights where our methods or data are insufficient, and where further work, ideally disciplined, safe, and multidisciplinary, is required. Community dynamics deserve one final mention. When ordinary people film at 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve, they insert themselves into a larger cultural script about thresholds and omens. Naming a presence, Ghost Malone, or circulating an attic image with a caption about midnight imbues an ambiguous clip with cultural freight.
That freight is real, and it shapes how we remember and share. It is also why our approach balances empathy and rigor. Contributors' fear and confusion are genuine, and the social consequences of mocking or dismissing them are real. We owe people respectful analysis and fair, testable pathways toward verification. We close where we began, on the cusp of a year, when people raise phones like talismans, and the night seems to hold a different kind of promise and threat. The clips we examined, the Baldwinville attic with the pale crescent and the laugh, the Arkansas home where a toy glided and a household named a presence, the child's rabbit that pivots at the edge of sleep, the bunker smear that startled an explorer, the collector's scraping that changed a live stream, the family's cluster of skylights, Paul's childhood silhouette, and Selma Mansion's knocking form a mosaic of the ways low light, sensor limits, architectural quirks, and human expectation combine to make the ordinary look ambiguous and sometimes uncanny. Our verdict, in every case, is provisional. We offer mechanical and psychological explanations that account for the observed signatures, and we point to tests that would strengthen or weaken those hypotheses: original files, multi-angle corroboration, controlled recreations, spectral comparison, and expert consultation. We recommend follow-ups rather than final pronouncements. When a clip appears in more than one recorder with consistent timing and spectral characteristics, it warrants elevated attention. When audio transients are smeared by streaming codecs or a single camera's internal processing, compression may be the culprit. When memory is the primary basis for a claim, treat it as a sincere testimony with known limitations. There's one more practical note about safety and legality. We urge anyone curious about investigating odd phenomena to prioritize safety and permission. Abandoned buildings are hazards. Entering property without consent risks injury and legal trouble. Recreate conditions only where you have permission and proper protective measures. If you want evidence assessed, preserve it. Don't handle or move items that could be evidence of an innocent mechanical cause. And if your footage involves a child, protect identities and privacy above all else. At 11:59 p.m. on New Year's Eve, the world tilts a fraction, and people look for meaning in that tilt. Phones capture more than light and sound. They capture our hopes and our fears. Technology can both reveal and deceive. We've tried in this episode to hold those two truths together, to honor the fear, to test the evidence, to suggest follow-ups, and to leave the final verdict to further data and discourse. If you are watching with a clip in hand, or if something similar has happened to you, we still want to see it. Send original, uncompressed files and any additional camera angles to the single submission email in the description. Tell us what you felt at the moment, who else was present, and whether you gave anyone permission to record. If you can't provide originals, tell us that too. Mark it indefinito, and include as much contextual detail as you can. Now, it's over to you. Which of these clips do you find most convincing, and why? Tell us your verdict in the comments, real or staged, and subscribe if you want more deep dives that balance curiosity with caution. We'll be back with more footage, more tests, and more attention to the fine line between what cameras catch and what we think we see.